Hey everybody, it's time once again for another one of Maynard's marvelous presentations, this time on Chapter 4 in Sociology. And this time it's on the chapter Society. So as is my due, I am going to start with a quote from William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, ever hear of him? Bard on the Avon, Romeo Juliet, Hamlet, anybody? No. Well, okay. Well, let me point this out. This is not a great example of it, but he was another one of those people. It wasn't just religious figures. He was a literary figure who was also kind of trying to tell us the way it is. In other words, his observations are very similar to those of the great mystics, the great sages, and speakers from religions and other cultures. Anyway, the quote I have for you today is, "Society is no comfort to one not sociable." Society is defined as people who interact with one another within a defined territory and who share a culture. So, starting on page 93 for the exam and your edification, you need to know about society and technology, the theory of Gerhard Lenski. Now, for Lenski, technological innovation is the driving force in social change and what he focuses on and calls sociocultural evolution. He argues that technological innovation determines not everything in a society, but does determine two fundamental things: the range of what is possible and the relative costs of its options. David Warsh said, "Political activity is shadow play. Technology is the underlying reality." So his basic argument is how we have progressed as societies, our societal evolution has been based on ever increasing technology. He argues that the amount of technological information a society has will also determine the rate how fast sociocultural evolution takes place. The more technology, the faster the evolution. Now, despite his emphasis on the role of technology in human societies, Lenski also saw societies evolving just as do living organisms. He said, "The first thing our ecological evolutionary perspective requires is that we establish the relationship of our societies to the rest of the world. Societies are part of the natural order," he argues. His pattern of sociocultural evolution is summarized on the table on page 97. You should memorize the names and basic traits of each of these 5 types of societies. Why? Well, it's not just for the purposes of the exam, because why do I pick out the topics I do for the exam? Because I think it's stuff you should retain from sociology, material you should retain from sociology. You will find that these titles for his different stages in sociocultural evolution are widely used beyond sociology. Anyway, the first one is the hunting and gathering societies. Now, the only other name I've often heard these sometimes called is foraging societies. Other than that, the names of the other phases in sociocultural evolution are pretty much universally used. Okay, so here's the idea. See if you can figure this out if you just knew the names. Hunting and gathering societies. Geez, I wonder, how do you think these people got by? How do you think they obtained the necessary food they needed? Could it be from hunting and gathering vegetation? That's correct. Damn, you're smart. Okay, so they had simple technology to hunt animals and gather vegetation. There's an old movie, I don't know if it's still around, called The Gods Must Be Crazy, where a Coke bottle falls out of the sky to these native peoples and they have no clue what's going on or what it means. Anyway, that's an example of hunting and gathering societies. There are still some around, mostly found in rather remote parts of the world. But there are still a few around. But for the most part, they are gone. Anyway, they first appeared from about 3 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago. Now, having said that, again, there are still some around. I should say they predominated from 3 million years ago to 12,000 years ago. So for most of our human history, we were hunters and gatherers, which is important to anthropologists because if you want some clues, perhaps, to what constitutes human nature, study hunting and gathering societies, because that's most of our human history. So 97% of these societies followed the rigid pattern of men hunt, women gather vegetation, and raise the kids. But that did not mean a difference in status, which is important because as we go through these different stages, you will see that the different jobs assigned to men and women did mean a difference in status in society later on. The average lifespan for a hunter and gatherer was only 22.5 years, which effectively meant after they graduated from college, they only had about a half year to pay back their loans. I'd say, why bother? Take out all the loans you can. So the big question becomes, at least for me, why do members of these societies cooperate in hunting and gathering and in the sharing of food? Even the shaman, the so-called connector with the gods, even the shaman must work and receive no greater material rewards. Well, why? I'll let you think about that. Time's up. Remember, whenever I say I'll let you think about that, you can pause and actually think about it or not. Okay, well, why? Is because they realized it was in their self-interest to cooperate for food, clothing, and shelter. What do I mean by self-interest? All living things are self-interested. If they were not self-interested, they could not survive. So it is your self-interest that has you pursuing a college education, for example. Now, self-interest is not the same as selfish. Self-interest, many people have argued in our current society, has become expressed as selfish. But that's another story for another day. Anyway, for our purposes and everybody's purposes, self-interest means the things you have to do in order to survive, not to the exclusion of the needs of other people, but simply you have to be self-interested. That's normal and it's reasonable to be so. So why do we cooperate? Well, they cooperated for the hunting and the gathering because they realized they needed each other in order for them to survive. In other words, they saw it as in their self-interest to cooperate in order for them to each personally survive. In other words, unless we all work together to get enough food, clothing, and shelter, there won't be enough for any one of us. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose they wanted to bring down a big ass yak. That's correct. If you go to the Museum of Natural History, you actually see an animal called a big ass yak. And on his left cheek, it says yes. And on his right cheek, it says no. You get that joke? You really understand rules of highway driving and tractor trailers. Moving on. So if they bring down the big ass yak, they have enough food for quite some time. However, no one individual was capable of bringing down the big ass yak on his own, or her own, his own, I guess, because men did all the hunting. So therefore, they had to work together to bring down the big ass yak. It was in their self-interest to cooperate in the gathering of food, clothing, and shelter. So in other words, economically, their form was cooperation. Okay, what else do we got here? Lenski explained that individual property rights among hunters and gatherers was limited to personal tools and weapons. Natural resources, including fields and forests, were defined as collective property, and so-called ownership was claimed by the group. In other words, the things they all depended upon in order to survive couldn't be privately owned. They were too important. Therefore, fields, forests, the animals were, if you want to use the term ownership, were thought of as collectively owned, although many of these indigenous peoples had no term for the word no word for the word ownership. Okay. Moving along, Lenski said, had there been no technological innovations during the last 10 to 12,000 years, all societies would still be small, nomadic populations of hunters and gatherers living much the way our Stone Age ancestors did. But now remember, they were nomadic, meaning they had to keep following the animals in order to have sufficient food, have a sufficient food supply. If you ever saw the movie Dances with Wolves, how Native Americans in our culture in the Plains states would follow the buffalo because the buffalo was the key to the sustenance of their life. They used everything about the buffalo, every part of the buffalo's body in some way, shape, or form for them to survive. So they would quickly pick up their teepees and huts and they would move right along to wherever they found the buffalo were roaming. However, about 12,000 years ago, new technologies developed based on the use of hand tools to cultivate plants and the ability to support the domestication of animals, resulting in that's right, horticultural and pastoral societies. Hort is Latin for garden, so the Latin horticultura means cultivation of a garden. Agricultura, which is the next phase in sociocultural evolution, means cultivation of a field. Pastoral is Latin meaning shepherd or literally feeder. Isn't that illuminating? Well, anyway. So the transition from hunting and gathering to horticultural and pastoral is from seeking food to growing food. In other words, these peoples no longer had to be nomadic. They found out because of the development, the technological development of hand tools, that as a result, they could cultivate their own garden. They didn't have to chase the vegetation. And they also found that because they could keep the animals in one place because they learned how to domesticate them, they don't have to go chase the animals anymore. Now, that didn't mean they still didn't go out and gather other vegetation in addition to their gardens, but for the most part, they no longer were nomadic peoples in this stage of our sociocultural evolution. As a result, these societies were able to produce more food, and thus their populations grew into the thousands. Hunters and gatherers only had populations in the hundreds. And 80% of the food is produced by women. So for the most part, it's women who are tending to gardens, and the males, for the most part, are looking after the animals or doing whatever hunting is necessary. The average lifespan was now 25 years. So for hunters and gatherers, it was 22.5 years. And for horticultural and pastoral societies, it's 25 years. That means you had 3 years after you graduate from college to pay back your loans. Cultural ecologists. Cultural ecologists, they argue that where peoples choose to live has a lot of influence on their thinking, knowingly or unknowingly. In other words, the climatic factors under which they live. So for example, the guy I'm about to quote, Marvin Harris, wrote an article about how people living in the Middle East, many of the religious admonitions are against the eating of anything from the cloven hoof, meaning most specifically swine. Now, the argument is the reason why is because it's very difficult to raise swine in a semi-arid climate like the Middle East. Therefore, it was impractical to do so. Therefore, it soon became a religious admonition not to do so. Anyway, he clarified the power of expanding technology by estimating that hunters and gatherers had to expend about 1 calorie in human energy to produce 3 calories of food value. Horticulturalists had to expend 1 calorie to get back 15 calories of food. Agrarian societies had to expend 1 calorie to get back 50 calories of food. And industrial societies people have to expend 1 calorie of food to get back 5,000 calories of food. That's because they're just called DoorDash. While private ownership of land is very rarely found among hunting and gathering peoples, as we discussed, um, it is usually the case among horticulturalists. And the arguing or the theory as to why this is the case is because people started getting to the idea of, I'm here busting my hump, digging this garden out. And so I ain't going to share it with you. Dig your own garden. There's plenty of room here for everybody. So all of a sudden it became mine, not yours, which is what private means. Private means to deprive others the use of. Okay, so it means it means less that it's mine than it's not yours. Interesting distinction. Okay, now this is an important point too. Remember I mentioned that women were producing 80% of the food. So these were largely matrifocal societies. Matra refers to mother, patra would refer to father. Patrifocal would be father-oriented societies. This was a matrifocal societies. 1/3 of horticultural societies had female-only deities. 1/3 had male and female deities. All of these so-called great mother societies were horticultural. Okay, so here's the bit. Sometimes, just for shock value, I will say to students when I say, well, how do you know what you've been raised to believe is absolutely correct? And I'll haul out just for shock value. How do you know the creator's a dude? Like, well, how do you know? Well, you don't know. You only know that or think that's true because people told you that's true. Who told you that? Religious authorities, your parents, who knows? Everybody told you, hey, God's a dude. But how do you know God's a dude? So my point being, in horticultural societies, God was not a dude. God was a dudess or something like that. Anyway, so why? Because when men are in charge and men are producing all the food, guess what? God must be a dude. But when women are producing the food and women are in charge, well, then of course, God must be a she. Lenski also reports the following densities in persons per square mile. In hunting and gathering societies, there is less than 1 person per square mile. In horticultural pastoral societies, 10 to 40 people per square mile. In agrarian societies, there's typically over 100 people per square mile. Industrial societies have densities that range from about 70 people per square mile in the United States to many hundreds of people per square mile, which is the case in most European nations, to nearly 1,000 people per square mile, which is the case in Japan and in the Netherlands. Next, agrarian societies. Here you move from thousands of people to millions of people. They began to predominate about 5,000 years ago. Agriculture, meaning using the technology of large-scale farming with plows powered by animals or advanced energy. For most of our history, our species has lived in hunting and gathering societies. However, during the last 2,000 or so years, agrarian societies have predominated even into the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, India and China finally moved from agrarian status to industrial societies. And they are the two largest populated nations in the world. Agrarian societies also demonstrated greater internal diversity. Greater internal diversity means the people didn't all look alike for the most part. Why? Is because you had dictators, monarchs, conquerors who would go across many lands and bring back people as slaves from those lands. So suddenly you had people with different types of skin tones all living together, as opposed to, say, horticultural and pastoral societies where it was all pretty tribal and local and everybody kind of looked like everybody else. You also had dramatic social inequalities. So the argument is, beginning with horticultural and pastoral societies, people began to develop a surplus. Well, when you have a food surplus, you can have more people. I even heard people argue sometimes that if you want to minimize population growth, stop producing so much food. Seems like a rather cruel way to go about it. But I get it. There's a connection, there's definite correlation, cause and effect between the more food that's available, the more the population can grow, which is also true of animal populations as well. For example, here in Pennsylvania, look how the white-tailed deer have expanded their territory and how many, many more of them there are. Why? Because they are eating quite well, eating corn from the farmers' fields that weren't available to them before in the abundance that it is currently. In fact, some of the biggest deer are no longer found in northern Pennsylvania. They tend to be scrawnier deer. They're found right around here. Anyway, so you have dramatic. So the idea was starting in horticultural and pastoral societies, they had more, and then they decided, maybe some people should get more than others, which wasn't the case with hunting and gathering societies, where people receive roughly whatever it is they needed or roughly equal amounts. Instead, now it's like, well, no, we have more. Maybe some people should get more. Who should get more? Well, surely the leaders should get more. After all, there are leaders. Wait a minute, what about the shaman? After all, the shaman keeps us connected with the gods, so that's important too. So all of a sudden, some people began to get more than others, and we were okay with that. And now we begin to create social inequality as some have more resources than others. When it gets to agrarian societies, it is exacerbated even more because of the great power of these dictators, monarchs, conquerors who have assembled vast amounts of riches while other people are relegated to slavery or serfdom, depending on what part of the world they lived in. Feminists also argue that it was agrarian societies that are the roots of male dominance. So in agrarian societies, men and women decided that plowing was men's work. Well, why did they decide this? Because on average, men tend to be stronger than women. Now, I will be the first to admit there are some women out there that are built like a brick shit house, and I would never want to mess with them. In terms of physical confrontation. But my point being, men on average are stronger. It kind of reminds me, here's another one of Maynard's amazing anecdotes. My hairstylist, for want of a better term, when you think about my hair, who I haven't visited in almost a year for COVID-19 reasons, she works out all the time and she is quite buff. And so one day I'm messing with it and I said, hey, I said, I see you working out all the time. You know, I pump a little iron myself. I said, come on, let's see what you got. Let's arm wrestle. Let's see what you got. And she said, yeah, sure. Well, anyway, this was a mistake within 2 seconds of starting it, because as soon as we said go, I could immediately see if she was playing me. And she took me down like I was yesterday's news. So that's what I mean. Some women are just much stronger than the average guy, or at least stronger than me. So anyway, getting back to the analogy, men and women decided that plowing was men's work. Why? Because men on average are stronger and plowing is physically draining. Therefore, 90% of the food is now produced by men. So men equal production, women equal reproduction. And as a result, 90% of the food being grown by men, what a surprise. 90% of the deities in these societies, agrarian societies, were gods a dude. We're back to gods a dude again. So physical strength determined power in the culture, and the sexes become highly polarized because, again, this change in status, this was not only a change in work assignment, but change in status. Men's work was more important because they were producing food than was women's work. So men's status in society ascends compared to how things were with horticultural and pastoral societies, where women's status was ascendant. Okay. Next, industrial societies. Again, millions of people. Here you have the production of goods using technology that powers sophisticated machinery with advanced sources of energy. So you have greater prosperity for a greater number of people, so the inequalities are less dramatic. You have occupational specialization, well, it kind of makes sense. What do you think was the most common job in an agrarian society? Could it be farmer? Yes, exactly. So what happens in industrial societies? Well, as a farmer, I'm producing my food for myself, but it's demanding work. It's hard work. It's seasonal, so to speak. You're so dependent on how things go with the season. So after a while, perhaps you get tired of this and say, you know what? I'm just going to work in the factory and then I'll get money with which I can purchase food from those people who continue to choose to grow food. So more pronounced occupational specialization because it's not just factory worker, it's all the different statuses within the factory itself, clerk, mailroom, whatever, boss, foreman, on and on. And you have less centrality, primacy of the family. So if you go back to agrarian cultures, you will see that, or agrarian societies, excuse me, you will see that the family was kind of one-stop shopping. They were in charge of religion, education, work and play were all one and the same. So the family was an incredibly important unit in society. But with industrial societies coming on, many of the functions that the family served were no longer necessary. So as America progressed, schools were developed and the family didn't have to provide education anymore. They brought over ministers, pastors, rabbis, priests, and all of a sudden the family's not in charge of religion anymore. And even the work and the play are not one and the same anymore because the parents may now be working in factories instead of at home. Marion Levi suggests that the ratio of inanimate to animate sources of energy is a good index of modernization. In other words, to the extent that you're still using animals to do work like pulling the plow, as opposed to a tractor pulling the plow, shows to what extent you are not yet modernized. However, with industrial societies, men's physical strength pushing the plow is no longer necessary. And as a result, women's status reascends so that women could at least in theory, take on jobs with the same status in society as men have. With the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, which was when? That's right, 1750. And again, why is that important? Because it marks the beginning of modern times, 1750. Now, I say with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, you know, it wasn't like, I don't know, it was New Year's Eve and people were singing, we're going to party like it's 1749 because the Industrial Revolution's coming the next day. This is just an approximate date. By the way, that little singing was for you Prince fans. If you're not sure, Google him. Had a famous song about partying like it's 19, never mind. Anyway, with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, technological innovation increased exponentially as it continues to do now. To give you an example, roughly 5 to 10% of all people who have ever lived are alive now. However, about 90% of all scientists who have ever lived are living now. Well, in addition to the negative impact in the environment, there are other limits of technology. I'm going to give you a quote from General Omar Bradley. He was a World War II hero. He commanded the American forces in the invasion of Europe in World War II. And this quote he made in 1948. But if you listen carefully, he could have made this quote yesterday. He said, "We have too many men of science, too few of God. We have grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. We know more about war than we do about peace, more about killing than we do about living." And finally, we are at the post-industrial society phase. Here, production centers on the creation, processing, storage, and application of information. The technological impetus for this phase in sociocultural evolution is the computer and the so-called information revolution. Typically, the workforce becomes more services oriented as opposed to manufacturing based. We'll cover this more when we get to the chapter on economics, but services means, if you think about it, most of the people you know are providing professional services to each other. And so it could be doctor, banker, nurse, social worker, dentist, on and on and on. Whereas in the past, in industrial societies, manufacturing was the key base, was the key economic base in society. Now, post-industrial societies include countries like the United States, Western Europe, Australia, Russia, Canada. So this is not unique to the United States, the service economy. This is true in all post-industrial societies. As a post-industrial society, the United States now spends more money on computers than on televisions. But I would argue TV is still king, because it's only because you can watch television programs on your computer, I argue. The industrial era moved goods, first by ship, then by rail, and more recently by truck on interstate highways. The post-industrial equivalent is information moving at the speed of light along the information superhighway. Okay, on page 98, we're going to get to society and conflict, the struggle between segments of society over valued resources, Karl Marx, the social conflict point of view. I've been talking about it up until now kind of abstractly, so today we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of the social conflict point of view as was developed by Marx. So for Lenski, society is defined by the type of technology. For Marx, society is defined by the type of social conflict. Now, to give you a little background on Marx, who is widely misunderstood, much of Marx's thinking evolved from his observations of life in London about 100 years into the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so for you math whizzes, let's see, it was 100 years after the Industrial Revolution began. When might that be? 1850, that's correct. Wow, that's impressive. Okay, so Marx is tramping around London in 1850 because now the Industrial Revolution is full bloom. So now he can see for himself what are the effects of the Industrial Revolution on society. By the way, this is under the heading of famous lies. Karl Marx once said, "I am not a Marxist." You know, that reminds me of some other famous lies by famous people. How about Nixon saying, "I am not a crook," which he said about a few months before Watergate forced him to leave office. He was a crook, I tells you, a crook. You can't say that about him. He's dead. Dead or alive, he was a crook. What else? How about Clinton's famous statement, "I did not have sex with that woman." Really? Define sex. What else? Did you know he got impeached too? He and Trump both got impeached. Now, the Senate did not go along with the impeachment, but both he and Trump were impeached by the House of Representatives. What else is a famous lie? How about W when he was president saying there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, has been meeting with the forces of evil. Who did he say they were meeting with? Al-Qaeda. They were meeting with. Well, it turns out both reports are absolutely untrue. The problem with that is that's what he used to run with in order to justify our invasion of Iraq, but both were incorrect. And don't even get me started on Trump, who is into well over his 22,000th documented lie while in office. Now, I know people say, well, they all lie, all the politicians lie. Well, my understanding is that in his 8 years in office, Obama had 18 documented lies. Trump is at 22,000 and counting. All right. Marx had great compassion for the plight of the poor in light of the riches acquired by a few. This is the difference between the workers, people who sell their labor, who he called the proletariat, and the owners, the capitalists, who he called the bourgeois, which is a French term meaning of the town. So the capitalists were the people who own and operate the factories and businesses in pursuit of profits. So you have either the workers or the people who they work for, the owners. Marx wanted to create a new social order based on a fair, a just distribution of resources. So his attack was focused solely on capitalism as an economic system that produces and distributes resources. As Gerhard Lenski saw technology as being a fundamentally important influence in society, so Marx saw the economic system, materialism, material things, as determining the entire character of society. He and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. In it, Engels said, quote, "The economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis, starting from we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of judicial and political institutions, as well as the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of a given historical period," unquote. So look at figure 4-1 on page 99 to see Marx's model of society. So you will see his argument is that everything starts with the economic system, the judicial system, everything is designed to support the current economic system. So other examples might be, if you go back into medieval times, the entire legal system was all designed to support the feudal structure, where you had approximately 10% were the nobles and 90% were the serfs. And religion was right in there supporting the whole arrangement as being fair and just. But it all started with that's the economic arrangement as being the most critical aspect of a society. Or if you go to the old antebellum South and you had slavery, that plantation system was all set up by laws supporting it in the South so that it was just seen as just and fair and a reasonable system. But the point is, the focus was on the economic system, and everything else is designed to support it in a society. Well, a key concept to understanding how capitalism works according to Marx is the term surplus value. This was seen by Marx as the key to the capitalists' accumulation of wealth at the cost of the proletariat, as well as the ownership of private property as being seen as natural. Now, why I say that term as seen as natural is because we already discussed that in hunting and gathering societies, anything other than your personal property, to own it was not considered natural. So to own forests and fields or something that people all dependent upon was not seen as natural. Under capitalism, individuals can own things everybody else are dependent upon, like fields and factories and so forth, but it's seen as just natural. That's the way it's always been. Okay, so how does surplus value work? Well, let me give you an example. Let's suppose I'm producing tie-dye shirts, because most of the faculty got a side gig. So let's say mine is producing tie-dye shirts. Why tie-dye shirts? Because I can't help but notice since the 1960s, they have continued to thrive. But see, my tie-dye shirts will be made by an authentic hippie, so they'll have that brand behind them. Anyway, so I'm producing tie-dye shirts, and because they are produced by an authentic hippie, they're selling like hotcakes. In fact, maybe I should sell hotcakes. Well, anyway, so they're selling so well that I can't produce enough myself to meet this growing demand. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to have to hire a worker. Now, listen to this carefully. I calculated after expenses that every hour a worker would work for me, he or she would be producing $20 of value to me, all right? So that worker is worth $20 to me after expenses. Given that, how much should I pay the worker, knowing the worker is going to be worth $20 to me in value? Let's think about this. Do I hear some suggestions? Yes, you. Minimum wage? Wow, that's harsh. Why? No, wait, what do you think? Hold on, here's another suggestion. $10, half the amount. 15, You know, I never hear anyone suggest 20. And why would I? Why would I want to pay somebody as much as that person makes for me and have all the headaches of, are you going to show up? Are you going to produce enough? Blah, 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 blah. So that doesn't make any sense at all. Now, as the owner, what makes the most sense for me? Minimum wage. Why? Because the less I pay the worker, the more I make. What makes the most sense for the worker? $15 an hour. Why? Because the more the worker makes, the more resources the worker can accumulate. So what Marx was arguing is the interests of the workers are always opposed to the interests of the owners right at the pay end. The more the owner pays the worker, the less the worker makes, the less the owner makes. The more the worker makes, the less the owner makes. So the whole idea is lowball the worker. Okay, well, every business effectively does this. And I'm not saying it's mean-spirited. I'm just saying it's the key to how you make a profit. And so this is what's called surplus value for Marx. So let me give you an example. First of all, none of you, unless you're in business for yourself, is getting paid the true value of your work, according to Marx. You are getting paid a percentage of your true value, with the rest going to the owners in what's called profits. Now, there are other aspects to accumulating profits, but that's the key. As long as you can keep wages down. Why? Because wages in most businesses are about 40% of your costs. So you can keep those under control. That's critical. That's exactly why corporations all over America began to shift their employment base to other countries. So why should I pay an American worker 18 bucks an hour, which is what many were making at that time 20, 30 years ago, when instead I can move the company over to Japan, or China rather, China's a better example, to China, and just pay a Chinese worker 25 cents an hour to do the same work and produce the same quality stuff, or at least close to the same quality. It's a no-brainer. And so that's exactly why they moved operations overseas. It was cheaper on the labor end. Now, in some cases, it did result in lower prices, and another, but dramatically what's happened since the 1970s, when this big wave of moving manufacturing overseas happened, among other things, is that the profits have gone through the roof at unprecedented levels since maybe 120 years ago for the owners. Meanwhile, wages for the workers in the United States have remained relatively flat. Okay, so let me see, give you some more examples. One time I was working at Kraft Foods. This was, I had several factory jobs while I was trying to pay off the mountain of debt I accumulated getting my master's degree in social work. And besides, I was in no rush. I was, holding out for a management position in social work, as they say. Anyway, so I'm working this factory job. It was night shift. I'm working in the warehouse at Kraft Foods. In fact, at Kraft Foods, I knew the big cheese personally. Anyhow, so I'm working night shift, and they would come up to me, the boss would say, "Hey, Cressman, can you work Friday night? We'll pay you time and a half." I go, "Yeah, sure. I need to pay off that, sure." "How about Saturday, Sunday? We'll pay you double time." What? "Yeah, great." "How about holidays? We'll pay you triple time." I'm thinking, yeah, I don't have a life. Sure, holidays, triple time. So I'm working triple time and thinking, now how the hell can they afford to pay me triple time and still make money? I went, oh, yes, of course, surplus value. They can actually afford at Kraft at that time to pay me triple time and still make money off of my labor. So here I am, so grateful for this job. Like, thank you, Massa, for this job. When in fact, the big cheese should have been standing out in the parking lot thanking every one of us for showing up. "Hey, you're coming again tomorrow, aren't you? Because you're making a shit ton of money for me. I hope you're coming back tomorrow. I hope you're coming back tomorrow." But we have it just the opposite. They're like, "Thank you for this job." And it is better than no job, but to make it sound like they're not making a heck of a lot of money off of us is not true either. So that is how surplus value operates. And there are people who are economists, Marxist economists, who actually calculate what the surplus value is in any given society. Karl Marx said, the bourgeois, during its rule of scarcely 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than of all preceding generations done together. While the negative aspects of capitalist living are seen by the proletariat, the workers, as being essentially the fault of those who are less successful. In other words, it's their own damn fault. Marx said that capitalism promotes this, and this is what you need to know for the exam. On page 99, you need to know about false consciousness. Why would the workers think that they're the reason that they're suffering economically? False consciousness is any belief explaining that the shortcomings of individuals, rather than the flaws of society, are responsible for widespread social problems. For example, playing the lottery encourages people to think that anyone can be rich. Well, you notice that the rich don't play the lottery. They don't have to. They're already rich. But for the rest of us, you kind of timeline it out and you go, okay, I see what I'm going to make in this job, and I got to pay back the college debt, and I got to pay for a car and clothes and blah, 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 and housing. And you begin to realize there is no way I'm going to become a millionaire unless I win the lottery or marry rich. We'll cover that later on in the course. Chronic unemployment is seen as some people are just too lazy to work, a very common myth, when in fact most people want to work and in fact do work. Okay, Pope Paul II said, the needs of the poor must take priority over the desires of the rich, and the rights of workers over the maximization of profits. So he was a little skeptical of capitalism as well. So Marx sought to replace this false consciousness, blaming ourselves for our plight, with class consciousness, the recognition by the workers of their unity as a class in opposition to capitalists and ultimately to capitalism itself. This class consciousness would also overcome the alienation, which is described on page 100, the alienation, which is the experience of isolation and misery resulting from powerlessness. Okay, alienation can happen in relationships. If you and your sig other family member are not getting along with each other, you begin to feel alienated, separated from them, and or powerless, because the other person in the relationship may control most of the power, and that control of power and the other person feeling powerless is also another way in which people feel alienated, separated from each other. He said this is felt by the workers in several different ways. One is the workers are alienated from the act of working in two ways. One is machines and robots are replacing the workers. So while it is true that some manufacturing is returning to the United States, it's replacing where there used to be, say, 5,000 factory workers producing automobiles. They're now replaced by a robotized factory where you only need maybe 200 workers to run the robots. And you have to have the special skills in order to do that. We're also alienated from the act of working in that we, the workers, typically have no say, let alone no vote. We're not even getting to that point. So forget vote, we have no say. To give you an example, let's suppose I'm running a business and I'm beginning to find that there's low morale and the workers are disgruntled. Now, I could be that kind of a person that cares enough that I don't want the workers to have low morale and be disgruntled. But let's suppose the only reason I care at all is because it's starting to affect performance, as in the bottom line, as in my profits. So now I got to do something about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go crazy and buy y'all some pizza for lunch and sit there and listen to your grievances And it'll be one of these deals like, as you're rattling them off, going, I'm so glad we had this conversation. Wow, I had no idea. That's bothering you too. Oh, why didn't somebody say so sooner? Please wait a minute. Let me write this down. Let me write. What else? Oh, let me write that down. Write that down. Okay, so the hour's up. You got some free pizza, Domino's. Nothing special here, folks. Domino's, where it looks like they just ran red paint over it and put little pieces of vegetable-like stuff and meat-like stuff on it to make it appear to be a pizza. But that's a story for another day. I'm not a big Domino's fan. Anyway, so we get done with the pizza. You're all feeling better because finally the boss is listening. Yep, I listen all right. Now I'm going to go back to my office. You know what I'm going to do with all those notes? I'm going to take them and put them right in the freaking shredder. And I don't give a shit. I ain't going to do nothing about it, especially if it's going to cost me more money. You know, I'm just going to make you feel better about it that I listened to you. Get it? Because you have no say in how I do things. And even if you do, I don't have to listen. Okay, there's also alienation from the products of the work, which are owned by the capitalists, not the workers. So you could be working in a factory that produces, I don't know, Jaguars or Rolls Royce, and you'll never be able to afford it because you don't own the factory. Only rich people are going to be able to afford those cars. So that's a little disconcerting. And there's also alienation from the other workers themselves. Alienation in the sense that that we compete with each other typically in the workplace. Why do we compete? Now, I know we'll talk about this a little later on. We get to groups and organizations that we're now starting to work more in teams in the capitalist workplace. But for the most part, we compete with each other. So let me give you an example. I gave you the example in a previous presentation about how if I go to Children Youth Services, just as an example, because this is true of many businesses too, that the average workers just work in these cubicles in this giant room where it's just kind of divided up in the cubicles. But at Children Youth Services, I'm not picking, I'm just using it as an example, the supervisors all have offices with windows on the perimeter of this big room where everybody else is working in cubicles. Okay, so word gets out that one of the master's level social workers is retiring, and so all of a sudden we need a new supervisor to get that coveted office with the window and no longer having to go out and make home visits. And so let the competition begin. Who shall I select? Well, I finally make my selection and I select so-and-so, and everybody goes, well, the only reason he selected her is because she sucks up to him all the time. Maybe true. But she didn't deserve it. So here you all are competing for that coveted spot. And whoever gets it, there's oftentimes some resentment involved because she got it, he got it, and you did not. And finally, there's alienation from human potential. That so many of the jobs we have is just unfulfilling work. All kinds of surveys I have found confirm this. One of my favorites is if you look going back to 1987 and you look at worker satisfaction today, in no age cohort of workers are people more satisfied than they were in the past with their jobs. In fact, they are all less satisfied in every age cohort. Another survey asked, on the whole, how satisfied are you with the work you do? Very satisfied, 50%, moderately satisfied, 36%, a little dissatisfied, 9%, very dissatisfied, 3 or 4%, don't know, 1%. You don't know whether or not you're dissatisfied with your work. Okay. The point being, many of us do jobs we're not really happy with. Now, I am not knocking at all being the burger flipper at McDonald's. It's a job. I've done similar kinds of jobs. I've done janitorial work. I've done garbage detail. I've done a lot of jobs. So I'm not knocking any kind of job as unseemly or whatever. I'm simply saying it's not human fulfilling. There's no way it's taking advantage of anybody's innate gifts or abilities by flipping burgers or by hauling garbage to a dump. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm not saying it's not valued. I'm not saying it's not necessary. I'm simply saying it's not necessarily fulfilling work in terms of human potential. Woodrow Wilson, ever hear of him? Woodrow Wilson. He was president of the United States. World War I, he argued to have a League of Nations to create world peace, because World War I was called the war to end all wars. And he started to create this League of Nations, but it never stuck. But it became the forerunner for something that did stick, the United Nations, some years later. Anyway, Woodrow Wilson said, "The truth is we're all caught in a great economic system that is heartless." Now here's a quote from Marx's mother, who was lamenting how her son could barely pay his debts for most of his life. She said, "I wish that Carl would accumulate capital instead of just writing about it." Yeah, that's right. He was living down in the basement, and his mother yelled down and said, "Carl, when are you going to get a job?" "Shut up, Mom, I'm writing." Marx believed in time the workers would reject the alienation that inhibits social change, would overthrow the capitalist order, and create a more cooperative, humane, and egalitarian system of production, which he called socialism. Egalitarian means equal. He said, instead of being in a class, the workers must become a social class, acting for themselves. He believed that the true nature of humans is to derive satisfaction from social pursuits and not to be individualistic and self-serving. Interestingly or not, you'll be the judge, Marx played only a minor role in sociology until the 1960s, when all of a sudden those stupid hippies discovered him and started talking about Marx and why can't we have a society like Marx described, instead of this competition and vast inequity that capitalism generates. Now, listen to this quote, observation, I should say, by Marx. Now, he made this in 1850, and if anything, it's even more true today than it was then. 1850 already observed this happening. Marx rejected capitalism despite its obvious productivity, because he said it's a system that turns us from people who use things and love people into people who love things and use people. Boy, does that not describe us today. People who love things and use people. Love your dress. How do you love an inanimate object? Can't even reciprocate love. Love your car. Same deal. Okay, next. Starting on page 101, you need to know about Max Weber and the rationalization of society. I know it looks like it's Weber, but in deference to his Germanness, we all call him Max Weber. He was kicking about on the planet between 1864 and 1920. He describes and focuses on the historic change from tradition to rationality as the main type of human thought. Okay, so think about the time frame, 1864 to 1920. So when did modern times begin? With the Industrial Revolution. Well, what does modern times begin? It means the beginning of the eclipse of traditional societies and the rise of modern industrial and post-industrial societies. So while Marx believed in materialism, Weber emphasized idealism, that human ideas shape and transform society, that society is largely a matter of people's subjective impressions. Victor Hugo said, "Nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come." So you may recall that idealism is associated with structural functionalists, or structural functional perspective. Weber believed that people in pre-industrial societies were guided by traditions, which were values and beliefs passed on from generation to generation. The longevity of these traditions was seen as proof of the reliability. In other words, these are traditions that have lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And why should we why should we adhere to them? Because they worked. We're still here, aren't we? And what did the traditions dictate? Every aspect of how we should live. And so going back to my first presentation when I talked about how people use trial and error to figure out what works best and eventually figured it out, then they passed it on down to their progeny with traditions. Follow these traditions. This is what works. This is how we stay sustained. Modern industrial society, he said, embraced a new thought mode, which he called rationality, which is deliberate, matter of the fact calculation of the most efficient means to accomplish any particular task. For Weber, rationalization is the eclipse of tradition and sentiment. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. First of all, what's rationalism? Rationalism is reason independent of experience leads to truth. So I don't have to go to the top of the Matterhorn and jump off first to realize, whoa, that's going to kill me. See, I can use rational thought, reason independent of experience, to stand at the top and go, you know, if I jump off this, I'm surely going to die. Therefore, I'm not going to jump. Okay, so why does he say there's a loss of passion and sentiment? Well, because if you think about traditional societies, they give you a modern day example would be the Amish. Religion and their life are one and the same. Now that's true for other people as well. Maybe not for most of us, but for many people, yes, their religious philosophies and beliefs are intertwined with their daily living experience. But for Amish, it's succinctly true. I'm not saying for every individual, but as a civilization. Now, that was also true for most of us in traditional societies because they were typically based on religious precepts, the traditions, but that's no longer the case anymore. And so those religious beliefs had certain sentiments and passions associated with it that when we go to rational thinking and discard those traditions, we also discard the passion and sentiment associated with it. He said this loss of deep human passions is one of the costs of modern living. Knowing that as a consequence of rational thinking, many people would struggle to now find ultimate meaning in this modern world, Weber concluded his analysis of rationalization with the suggestion that some people would find irresistible, quote, the arms of the old churches open widely and compassionately awaiting them. And so the idea is, hey, we'll at least continue to belong to organized religion, and therein we'll find that. Now, that kind of equated to, for many people, you go about your daily life, and then on the weekend you attend a religious ceremony, and it's sort of like going to the filling station. You get filled up again, and then you got to go out into the modern world and deal with everything you have to deal with. Oh, then back to the filling station on the weekend to try to get recharged and re-energized with religious precepts again. Weber saw technological innovation as heavily promoted in some societies, yet hindered in others, according to the way the people understood the world, which again is idealism. For an example, look at Global Map 4-1, which shows differences globally in high technology expenditures, in this case, personal computers, as evidence of this point. So if you look at that map, you will notice those countries that don't spend much on computers are those countries that are still traditional societies. Why would you need to spend money on computers? You don't need them. You just follow the traditions. So in those countries that still embrace tradition, you don't see rational thought and technology expanding as rapidly. Weber saw rationality as rooted in Europe. Well, let me go through this thought stream. This is Weber's great thesis, Protestantism and Calvinism. And his argument is, here's the roots of capitalism lie in religion. So I'll kind of go through this, and my apologies to Weber if this is slightly askew, but hey, it's my interpretation. Okay, so in the early 1500s, you may recall there was Martin Luther King, not Jr., Martin Luther, not even Martin Luther King, Martin Luther, correction, Maynard, Martin Luther, and the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so Martin Luther is a Catholic priest, and he sees all the abuses taking place in the Catholic Church. For example, he notices, as did most of the public, that the nobility were getting away with all kinds of sins that, would not be tolerated in the common person. Well, why? They're the nobility, and they had a cozy relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, so they kind of do anything you want to do. Well, he said this is wrong. So he posted his thesis. I think it was 102 things he wanted to see changed. And a misunderstanding about him is he was never trying to start his own religion. He was simply trying to reform the Catholic Church. And even a couple of years later, after he nailed his thesis on the church and created all the reaction to it and the rebellion of many against the Catholic Church, he was urging those rebelling to not leave the church. Nevertheless, Protestantism developed. So these were other Christian denominations with different interpretations of the New Testament, trying to get rid of the rigidity, as they saw it, the rigidity of the I guess I would say unfairness of how the Catholic beliefs were applied differently to the nobility and to the average person. So one of those Protestant denominations that developed was Calvinism, named after its founder, John Calvin. Wouldn't it be cool to have a religion named after you? Like I could have one called Mr. Fabism. It'd be so awesome. Well, moving on. What did Calvinists believe? Well, some of this is pretty logical. At least there's an internal logic to it. As I go along with this, you'll see. So Calvinists believed in predestination, as did many Protestant denominations. Predestination means by the time you are born, God, the Creator, knows whether you're destined for heaven or you're destined for hell, which makes sense because the Creator is seen as all-knowing, omniscient. So therefore, the Creator would know. Okay, that's kind of makes sense. So people then thought about, well, that's cool, but I'd like to know if in fact I'm going to heaven or I'm going to hell. Now, for most people, it was like, I want to know if I'm going to heaven. For me personally, I'd be more concerned about, am I going to hell? Not so much concerned, but if I'm going to hell anyway, school's out. There's not much limit to what I do now, let alone if I knew I was going to hell anyway, I might as well go for it. Well, that's just me. Most people wanted to know if they were going to heaven. And if you were going to heaven, then you were one of God's elect. Notice how the terms have changed, the meaning of the terms. So elect back then meant you were going to heaven. Now elect's just a political term. Well, then the idea was, okay, so far so good. Now, Lord, oh Creator, could you give us a physical sign, a worldly sign that somehow I am predestined for heaven? And they determined that worldly sign would be great prosperity, wealth. So in other words, if the Creator showered you with wealth, that was a sign you were going to heaven. Now put aside this thought for a moment. Well, wait a minute. What if you were showered with poverty? Does that mean you were going to hell? Pretty much, but we'll come back to that. Okay, so here's where the twist in logic comes. So far, so good. But then all of a sudden people decided, well, here's the deal. What if I engineer my own wealth? What if I accumulate wealth? If I make a special effort to accumulate wealth, will I then go to heaven? Which is a little different than God showering you with wealth. You're going to create it yourself. You're going to engineer it. Well, that's how people interpret it. And so they went about doing it. Now, at this period of time, the feudal system is breaking down big time. And so it was possible for individual entrepreneurs to accumulate great wealth, and many did. There was only one little fly in the ointment there, and that is in the New Testament, it said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the gates of heaven. What are we going to do about that? Okay, so they determined that meant you can't take the wealth and spend it on you self-indulgently, like getting a gold ox cart or something. No. that would violate the camel through the needle thing. So therefore, they decided that you can take the wealth and you could accumulate it, but you can't spend it on yourself directly. You just have to reinvest it, reaccumulate it into your business, called capital reinvestment, hence capitalism. Ta-da! Please hold your applause. There will be a donation jar next to your computer on the way out. Please feel free to put in bills only. Okay. Now, let's get back to the poor for a moment. Yes, if you weren't showered with prosperity, it was a sign you were going to hell. Now, people took this literally and they were told, don't give any money to the poor. They're going to hell anyway. You know, it's less money for you and it's wasted money giving it to the poor. They're going to hell. So this was a moral thing. If you were going to heaven, it was a moral thing, you know, as they interpret it, because God was going to get you to heaven because you were wealthy. And if you were poor, you were going to hell. So this is a moral thing. So even today, we somehow see something, we somehow view the poor as being morally deficient for being poor, that somehow it's their fault and somehow in the eyes of God, it's wrong. This is so true that even if you go in the late 1800s and you look at the early forms of social worker, the so-called friendly visitors, and these were rich Christians who decided it was their Christian duty to help out the poor in the cities. They would go to the poor and they wouldn't give them a sandwich or food. In fact, they were purposely told not to do that, that would just make them dependent on them. Instead, they would give them a Bible. And so they'd say, here you go. See, the reason why you're poor is you're morally deficient. Read this Bible and you'll no longer be morally deficient and you will no longer be poor. And the poor would frequently ask, can I have a sandwich while I read the Bible? Go, no way. That'll just make you dependent upon me for the sandwich. Unfortunately, some were so desperate they probably had to eat the Bible. But the point being, they were considered morally deficient even in the late 1800s. And I argue there's still that suspicion today. There's something about people with low income that they're morally deficient. There's something about them. Well, we'll get to that later on in the course when we talk about social welfare. Now, Weber saw capitalism as having developed from a complex of other factors as well, not just the thought process I described, but he thought this was the main thing. So for Weber, the Protestant ethic, which was originally a religious ethic, later became a work ethic. As the spirit of capitalism becomes disenchanted. I'll come back to that in a moment. I want to get back to, I forgot to mention this, about the poor being seen as sufficient. Calvin said one, Luther said the other. I also remember who said what, but one said that idleness is next to sinfulness and work is next to godliness. So you could see how not working for whatever reason was seen as sinful and morally deficient. Okay, so Weber argues that the spirit of capitalism becomes disenchanted. Let me give you an example. Disenchanting means disconnected from the creator. Chanting, and virtually all major organized religions have some form of chanting, whether it's chanting a mantra or it's counting rosary beads and on and on and on. Those are all, chanting is a way of connecting to God. So when you're disenchanted, you're disconnected. So this disenchanted Calvinist Protestant ethic becomes evident in three impersonal modern types of people, all of whom are highly disciplined, but they're devoid of religious piety. So you have the capitalist whose devotion is to profits, the scientist whose devotion is to knowledge, and the bureaucrat whose devotion is to duty. Hey, and I promised you get things in this course you will hear nowhere else, nor would you want to hear them, maybe even the first time. But nevertheless, I'm going to lay one on you anyway. Maybe you'll find this in an economics course, I don't know. An illustration of disenchantment is found in the practice of early Calvinists of keeping a personal ledger of their moral activity. Okay, why did they do that? Well, this has been a big debate in religious circles, Christian religious circles, as to whether or not doing good works could be another way to earn your way into heaven. So that even if you're not wealthy, what if you did enough good works? Could you earn your way into heaven? And some argue this is one of the reasons behind philanthropy by wealthy people in that earlier period of time. Anyway, I'd like to believe that philanthropy is also based on people of wealth, and I know it's true, genuinely caring about others. Anyway, so the idea was they would keep a ledger of all their good deeds. And I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe it was the thinking like, okay, here I am, and I'm in front of St. Peter in the pearly gates, and he has the great book of deeds in front of him. And I say, oh, Peter, am I in? And he said, I'm sorry, Maynard, you're not in. The cutoff point was 100 good deeds, and I got you down for 96. I go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Pump the brakes there, St. Peter. I got my own ledger here, and I got myself at 105. Look, helped little old lady across the street, bought Girl Scout cookies, on and on. It's the only reason I can think of. Why would you keep your own ledger? And how would you know what the cutoff point was anyway? Yeah, I don't know. But they didn't call it their ledger. They called it their accounting. See, so accounting used to mean an accounting of your moral deeds. Now accounting is just about money. Another example of how it's all become disenchanted. Elect used to mean you were going to heaven. Now it means you're going to get elected to a political office. So all these terms changed over time. Catholicism was more concerned with good deeds than were the Calvinists. Thus, Weber said capitalism thrived initially in Europe in areas where Calvinism was the strongest. Righty here. Weber saw the organizational mode called bureaucracy as the logical expression of rationality, which is kind of ironic because we think bureaucracies are kind of irrational and inefficient. But we're going to cover this more fully when we get to Chapter 7, Groups and Organizations. To summarize, Marx and Weber disagreed on industrial capitalism. Weber saw it as having many benefits and saw it as the essence of rationality and how capitalists pursue profits. Marx saw capitalism as irrational because it failed to meet the basic human needs of most people by promoting economic inequality. In other words, let's go back to my first presentation. What's the function of an economic system? Make sure everybody has adequate food, clothing, and shelter in your civilization. Well, Marx observed capitalism doesn't do that at all. A handful of people have great wealth and the rest of the people seem to be struggling. So how can you say that the economic system therefore works? Both Marx and Weber agreed that alienation and dehumanization were products of capitalism. And as Massionis, the author of your text, notes, by the end of Weber's life, he became very pessimistic about just how dehumanizing the modern world had become. Do take some time to read about Emile Durkheim and his types of solidarity. It's an important concept in sociology. Not important enough for me to put it on the exam, but it's important enough for you to know. So please look it over. Okay, the difference between mechanical and organic solidarity, the difference between small communities and big cities in modern life. It's pretty interesting. Okay, do I got anything else for this chapter? No, that's it. Thus endeth chapter 4 in sociology. Okay, so stay tuned. One of these days soon, I'll have chapter 5 ready for you to preview and enjoy. Anyway, take care, kids. Bye.